As Michigan's most powerful and influential voice for business, the Michigan Chamber of Commerce stands ready to serve you. Go to mychamber.com, that's MICHAMBER.com, to learn more now.
Kerry Jr. II here, and before we get into the episode today, we want to update you on a story we previously told you about. On April 4th, 26-year-old Patrick Lyoya, a Congolese refugee, was fatally shot by a white Grand Rapids police officer. An investigation was launched, and on Thursday, we learned the outcome. Kent County Prosecutor Chris Becker announced that the officer, Christopher Schur, would face a charge of second-degree murder. If he's convicted, he could be punished with life in prison with the possibility of parole. For more on the history of Grand Rapids policing and why some activists say Lyoya's death was an inevitability, make sure to check out our previous episode on that topic. For more on the charge and what Lyoya's family had to say, check out treep.com. Okay, now for today's show. On June 1st, city officials gathered to raise a flag over Detroit's famous Spirit Plaza. It was the first day of Pride Month, and the flag raised was rainbow, but it may not have been the flag you've most often seen in support of the LGBTQ plus community, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning. This one had extra colors, black and brown for marginalized communities, pink, light blue, and white for transgender and non-binary individuals, and it had an arrow. It's a call for progress hanging over the city 50 years after the first City Pride Festival, and echoing the spirit of that first Detroit march decades later.
Oftentimes, people are going to Motor City Pride or other prides with not necessarily knowing its origins.
On this week's episode, we speak to historian Tim Retzloff, who just released a comic book about that first march.
One in Detroit. To them, the idea of marching in the streets was appalling because they had their lives to safeguard. The younger generation didn't have that mindset.
We explore the history of Pride and the history of Motor City Pride, which drives tens of thousands of people to our streets every year and takes place on June 11th and 12th. I'm Kerry Jr. II, and this is On the Line.
This little rainbow light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine all the time. It's divine.
So to get us started, could you introduce yourself for us, your name, title, occupation, and what's your connection to this event?
Sure. My name is Tim Retzloff. I am an adjunct assistant professor at Michigan State University, where I teach history and LGBTQ studies. My connection to Motor City Pride is that Isabel Claire Paul and I have done this comic book to tell the story of the very first Pride 50 years ago.
So it's the story of the very first Pride. We'll get to that in a second. First thing I want to ask is, have you attended Motor City Pride, ever been to it, and could you describe it if so?
The first one I ever attended was 1986 as a 22-year-old. 1986 was also the year that the Supreme Court had its ruling in Bowers versus Hardwick, in which they decided that it was okay for states to criminalize sodomy and make our intimate lives criminal. And that was a ruling that was not overturned until 2003. In some ways, it's like a big street festival. In some ways, it's like a big family reunion and a big party, which also kind of ties into why we wanted to do this story about the first one, because the first one was considerably smaller with a more decided political bent.
So can you set the scene a little bit for us in like a present day Pride? What is the atmosphere like? What are some of the sounds, the colors that we'd see if we were to attend?
Well, I mean, of course, you're going to see the rainbow of colors. It's a vibrant scene. there's bustle, there's, people seeing each other, and, it's not unlike other kind of street festivals that occur in other communities or for other purposes.
And what's the importance of this festival?
Well, it's been held in Michigan since 1972. It's held in June to mark the anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising in 1969, when the patrons of a Greenwich Village bar spontaneously fought back against a police raid. And there were several nights of rioting. They weren't going to take it anymore. They had decades of being subject to arrest, or decades of being subject to being institutionalized because it was considered a mental illness, family shunning and ostracization from the church. A younger generation decided that it was really important to commemorate the riots. And so in New York, they had the first Christopher Street Liberation Day in June of 1970. And then over the years, more and more cities started joining in.
And so, if I make sure I hear you correctly, this fest, along with a lot of the fests across the nation, are a way of folks asserting this is who we are. We're no longer going to we're never longer going to hide in the shadows because you're not accepting of us. We're accepting of ourselves.
That's absolutely the germ of it. But oftentimes people are going, to Motor City Pride or other prides with not necessarily knowing its origin. It's certainly transformed at different moments in time, where sometimes it's more of a celebration of community, and sometimes it's more of a moment of protest.
But I want to go back to what you've already said about why you wrote the comic book about the original first Pride. Can you just talk about that?
Articles and talks come and go, and you don't always necessarily reach a wide audience. There's also kind of this accessibility and reaching an audience that that people don't always read history or queer stories in, that kind of appealed to me. And then my friend Isabel had been a student at the College of Creative Studies, and I remember seeing her first student show and being dazzled by her work.
Can you tell me a little bit about what people would expect to see if they were to read it?
It starts with kind of talking about how it was organized and how it was inspired, and kind of the impetus came from this woman named Gay Whiteside, who was the leader in the first lesbian specific group in Detroit called the Daughters of Bilitis. And she knew about these events in Chicago and New York, and she was kind of perturbed that nothing had happened in Detroit. So she got the ball rolling, but then other groups kind of became involved, particularly campus groups. So part of the comic tells, the story of the planning, including this great drag pageant at a bar in Lansing, whose winner ended up leading the parade, leading the march in Detroit. And I'll note that that the text is entirely quoted material except for dates and places.
After the break, the first march, the fight against HIV/AIDS and anti-gay rhetoric, and what the past means for Pride today.
As Michigan's leading statewide business advocacy organization, the Michigan Chamber of Commerce is on the job every day standing up for job providers in the legislative, political, and legal arenas. We are the unified voice of thousands of members who employ over 1 million Michiganders. We work with trade associations and local chambers of commerce of every size and kind in all 83 counties of the state. We know business business in Michigan. Learn more today about how we can protect, connect, and strengthen your business. Whether that's advocating on your behalf at the Capitol, helping meet your informational, training, and networking needs, or boosting your bottom line visibility and voice, we're on the job for you. Make My Chamber your chamber. Go to mychamber.com, that's MICHAMBER.com, to learn more now.
And we're back speaking to historian Tim Retzloff, who just released a comic book about the first Detroit Pride Parade, which took place 50 years ago this June. Can you set the scene for us across the nation at the time as it relates to LGBTQ rights particularly?
So 1972, this period of fervent that's known as gay liberation was kind of picking up steam across the country. But, what was then kind of known basically as gay life largely centered around bars and commercial nightlife and kind of more private spaces. There'd been some new organizations that had just started. There was one surviving organization from the 1960s called One in Detroit that was made up primarily of established, mostly white, middle-class men, largely suburban, who were really closeted. And to them, the idea of marching in the streets was appalling because, they had their lives to safeguard. But a younger generation didn't have that mindset.
Can you describe a little bit about what the fear was for them at that time?
At the time, it was still criminal. So people risked arrest, and people certainly were still being arrested in the early 1970s. The climate and the atmosphere in Michigan, in some ways was harsh. There was a lot of ridicule. But there's also kind of this political and cultural vein of progressivism. But people were still scared that day. The only woman to speak that day was a young lesbian named Susan Swope, who used a pseudonym when she wrote in the Gay Liberator newspaper. She used Susan Williamson, and she was actually still heterosexually married at the time that she gave her speech, and she had just been kind of exploring her lesbian self. So she was very nervous about, maybe being shown on TV. But in the end, she decided that it was too important to kind of give a speech and to speak out and to have her voice heard.
As you were speaking to before, the festival, the march, it's evolved over the years. Sometimes it's more celebratory. Sometimes it can be more about the issues and advocating for those issues. As we move from 72 to 2022, what are the key dates along the way that kind of exemplify the evolution of what this event means, but also what it's mean for our society to evolve with the LGBTQ community?
When Anita Bryant emerged in the late 1970s, she was part of a backlash against gay rights that was going on, and she led a campaign in Dade County, Florida, to repeal their gay rights ordinance. And she launched a national campaign called Save Our Children, because under her mind, gay people couldn't reproduce, so they had to recruit. And in response to her, people in Michigan, particularly involved in the Metropolitan Community Church of Detroit, thought it was important to be ready in case Anita Bryant came to Detroit. It led to the formation of an organization called the Michigan Organization for Human Rights.
And then where did it go from there?
That was the precursor and led to Equality Michigan now. So there were several years when more kind of took over having this annual event. And then in 1989, they decided that rather than have a parade, it was more important to have a march. This is in the middle of the the HIV/AIDS crisis, when government inaction meant the death of a lot of gay and bisexual men. So they decided to move, the big march to Lansing. It's kind of the start of what's now Michigan Pride. But people in Detroit continued to start having some kind of celebration or festival, first on the Wayne State campus, and then at some point, some organizers moved it out to Royal Oak. It was held at Oakland Community College for several years. And it moved to Ferndale and became a street fair there. And then in 2011 is when they moved it back to Detroit.
I have one clarification question. Why did the festival change locations over the years?
I think part of it had to do with who was doing the organizing.
Okay.
But then, the other piece of this is, of course, particularly in Metro Detroit, all of these developments are against the backdrop of kind of the racial dynamics of this region. So there was a point where, much of the white gay world of Metro Detroit had moved to the suburbs. Another thing that happened is kind of there developed this simultaneous flourishing of specifically Black gay culture. So in the mid-1990s, there's the emergence of the Hotter Than July celebration, which is a specifically African-American gay event that's been held, every year since. That's specific to Detroit, is predominantly people of color.
And what other particular political aims have there been over the years in alignment with these festivals? As society has evolved over time, I'm curious how that has evolved.
I think issues of having to do with how transgender people are treated in society, a move in a direction of appreciating how sexuality and gender can be fluid. I think those have become, kind of part of the dialogue and part of the message in many respects. But some events are more political than others, and I don't know to the extent that visibility itself is kind of a political statement.
What is the significance of the Pride being in downtown Detroit?
Obviously, as the largest city in the state, it's important. When it moved to Detroit from Ferndale, there was a lot of throwback attitudes about the city. As a historian and archivist, I remember gathering, images online from that first event. And it was just curious to me that people were coming to this event from all over. So I think there had been some anxiety about, if we have events in Detroit, that people won't come, that there was still kind of this anxiety, white anxiety about Detroit. I'm very glad they've been proven wrong.
Are there any stories from your experiences your previous experience at Pride that you'd want to share?
Well, this is not a Pride per se, because it was specifically a march on Washington. And when I went in 1993, Between the Lines had just started, and I was writing for Between the Lines, and so I had a press pass. And I remember there was a catwalk where you could crouch and take pictures. If you've been to Washington, kind of the National Mall where you're in front of the Capitol, you see the Washington Monument, and then way in the distance, you see the Lincoln Memorial. And I remember being on that catwalk and looking out on a sea of people. And as a kid who grew up in Flint, who had a rough adolescence in high school in the early 80s, and thought I was the only one in the world, just kind of the experience of seeing that many queer people was life-changing. And I think that is one of the things about Pride. You go to your first Pride and it's like all of these people around you are like family.
So we've been through a lot of history today. What are the key takeaways?
I just think it's important to understand that there are people who have come before who, in some instances put themselves on the line to kind of be true to themselves. And, there have been moments of backlash and some of these tropes, the idea that the queer community is bent on grooming young children with our stories really is reminiscent of some of the rhetoric that Anita Bryant used. And here it is again, the importance of LGBTQ plus people to share our own stories and make ourselves be seen, to counter the stereotypes. I think, that's a lesson from the history. It's also a lesson that can be drawn from today.
You can pick up a copy of Tim Retzloff and Isabel Claire Paul's comic Come Out in Detroit for free at Motor City Pride, the Detroit Historical Museum, and numerous other locations including Cass Cafe in Detroit. For a complete list, check out comeoutindetroit.com. Motor City Pride kicks off at 1 p.m. Saturday, June 11th at Hart Plaza and runs through the weekend, with a parade at noon downtown on Sunday, June 12th. Sounds from Pride in this episode were provided by festival organizers. This episode was produced by me and Darcy Moran. Anjanette Delgado and Marianne Struman are our executive producers. Peter Bhatia is our editor. The music for the show is called Fort Trumbull and was produced by DJ Lost Boy. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, leave a rating, subscribe, and share it with your friends and your family. See you next week.